There is a particular kind of beauty that makes people uncomfortable, not because it offends, but because it demands acknowledgement. Kayla Mercer had that kind of beauty, the sort that caused strangers to pause mid-sentence, to lose their train of thought, to glance back twice when she walked past. She stood 5'8", with dark auburn hair that caught light like copper wire in the sun, wide green eyes set beneath strong brows, and the kind of bone structure that photographers describe as effortless. She was 23 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years learning, sometimes painfully, that beauty could be a door and a cage at the same time. She had grown up in Harlan County, Kentucky, the kind of place where everyone knew your name before you knew theirs, where the mountains pressed in close on all sides, and the town's memory was long and unforgiving. Her mother, Denise, had raised her mostly alone after her father left when Kayla was 11. They lived in a small 2-bedroom house on a road that flooded every spring, and Denise worked double shifts at the county hospital as a nursing aide for nearly a decade. Kayla had watched her mother's exhaustion with the silent, absorbing attention of a child who understands that love often looks like sacrifice. She had decided early on that she would find a way out, not out of love for her mother, but out of the particular suffocation that small towns press onto ambitious young women. The way out came, improbably, through a mall in Knoxville when Kayla was 19. A regional talent scout had handed her a card beside a Foot Locker, the kind of encounter that sounds like a bad movie, but occasionally turns into something real. In Kayla's case, it turned into a signed contract with a mid-tier agency in Nashville, a handful of regional campaigns for outdoor brands, and a local car dealership, and eventually, 2 years later, a modest but growing presence in the commercial modeling world. She wasn't on magazine covers, she wasn't walking runways in New York, but she was working consistently, earning a real income and building the kind of portfolio that suggested larger things were possible. By the spring of her 23rd year, she had moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where her agency had a stronger footprint and where the cost of living was manageable enough on a model's irregular income. She shared a 2-bedroom apartment in the No-Da neighborhood with her best friend, Brianna Cole, a graphic designer with a dry sense of humor and an aggressive collection of houseplants. The two of them had met at a casting call 3 years earlier, bonded over a mutual contempt for the same agency coordinator, and been nearly inseparable since. Their apartment was cheerful and cluttered, fairy lights strung along exposed brick, a second-hand velvet couch in deep green, the persistent smell of Brianna's jasmine candles. Kayla had been happy there in the uncomplicated everyday way that people rarely recognize as happiness until it's gone. The problem began in February, which is when Brianna's company offered her a 6-month remote assignment in Austin. Brianna agonized over it for 2 weeks before accepting, and Kayla told her genuinely, without performance, that she should go. What Kayla did not immediately solve was the practical consequence. She could not cover their rent alone, not reliably, not while she was also trying to save enough to cover the costs of a portfolio expansion her agency had been nudging her toward. She began looking for a new roommate in March, posted on 2 apps, had 3 awkward introductory coffee meetings, and found all 3 candidates quietly wrong in ways she struggled to articulate to Brianna during their nightly calls. It was during this stretch of frustration that Dale Pruitt re-entered her life. Dale was technically her first cousin, the son of her mother's older brother, Raymond, who had moved his family to Raleigh decades ago and maintained only the thin obligatory contact of Christmas cards and the occasional wedding. Kayla had met Dale perhaps a dozen times across her entire childhood, mostly at family gatherings where he lingered at the edge of rooms and said little. He was 11 years older than her, which meant that when she was 8 and 10 and 12, he was a fully grown adult who had no particular reason to seek her out. And yet, in the way that certain memories embed themselves without explanation, She had always carried a faint unease about him. Nothing she could name. Nothing that had ever hardened into a specific incident. Just the particular quality of his attention, the way his eyes tracked her across a room, the way he always seemed to know where she was standing, even when he appeared to be looking elsewhere. She had not seen him in over 4 years when he called her on a Tuesday evening in late March. He had gotten her number from her mother, he said, which was true. Denise had mentioned to Raymond that Kayla was looking for a roommate, and Raymond had apparently mentioned it to Dale, and Dale had filed the information away and dialed her number 9 days later. He explained with a practiced reasonableness that he had recently moved to Charlotte for a new IT position, that he had a 2-bedroom apartment in the Midwood area, and that the second bedroom was currently empty and available. The rent he named was genuinely low, well below market rate, he acknowledged, because he didn't need the money, he said, just the company. He used the word company twice in the span of 90 seconds, which Kayla would later mention to Brianna on the phone that same night with a short, uncertain laugh. She did not say yes immediately. She spent 2 days considering it, running the practical math against her discomfort. The rent was less than half of what she currently paid. The location was convenient to 2 studios she worked with regularly. And the unease she felt was, she reminded herself, rooted in childhood impressions, in the vague social awkwardness of a man she barely knew. He was family. Her mother, when Kayla called her, said that Raymond spoke well of Dale, that he was a quiet man, a hard worker, that Kayla should give him the benefit of the doubt. He's always been a little strange, Denise said, but strange isn't dangerous. Kayla agreed to move in on the understanding that it was temporary, 3 months at most, until she could stabilize her finances and find a more permanent arrangement. She texted Dale the confirmation on a Thursday afternoon. "I'll do it. Just need a few weeks to figure out the logistics. This is temporary, okay? 3 months max." He replied within 40 seconds. "Of course, I'm just glad you said yes. I've been hoping you would." She moved in on a Sunday in early April, Brianna helping her carry boxes despite already being 2 weeks into Austin, having driven back for the weekend specifically to help. Brianna did not say that she had a bad feeling. She was careful not to say that. But when she hugged Kayla goodbye in the parking lot of Dale's building and held on a beat longer than usual, Kayla had laughed and said, "I'll be fine, B. It's 3 months." Brianna had nodded and smiled and driven away and cried for 20 minutes on the highway, heading back to the airport. 4 days later, Kayla Mercer was dead. The apartment was nicer than Kayla had expected. That was her first thought when Dale carried her last box through the front door and set it down in the hallway with a careful precision that struck her as slightly performative, too deliberate, too aware of being watched. The space was clean, sparsely furnished, and cold in the way that rooms are cold when no one has truly lived in them. The walls were bare except for a single framed topographical map of North Carolina hung perfectly centered above the couch. The kitchen counters held nothing but a coffee maker and a dish rack with 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 mugs, a detail she noticed and then immediately told herself she was reading too much into. Her room was at the far end of the hallway, separated from Dale's by a bathroom and a linen closet. It had a window that faced east, and the morning light came through in wide, pale strips that she found genuinely lovely. She unpacked her clothes first, then arranged her small collection of skincare products on the bathroom shelf she had been assigned. The lower one, she noticed, while Dale's occupied the upper, and told herself that the stiffness in her shoulders was just the fatigue of moving. That first evening, a Sunday, they ate dinner together at the kitchen table. Dale had cooked pasta with a jarred sauce, garlic bread from a tube, a bagged salad. It was the kind of meal that communicated effort without revealing skill, and Kayla thanked him sincerely and meant it. Conversation moved in the careful, probing way of people who share blood but not history. He asked about her modeling work with an attentiveness that was almost studious, leaning forward slightly, asking follow-up questions about specific campaigns, specific photographers, specific cities she had traveled to for shoots. She answered openly, the way she always did with new people, because openness had always felt safer to her than guardedness, less likely to be misread, less likely to create the kind of silence that imagination fills in badly. It was only later, lying in bed with her phone propped on her chest, that she replayed the conversation and realized he had asked a great deal about her schedule, which days she worked, which studios, how late shoots typically ran, whether she usually came home directly afterward or stopped somewhere first. She had answered all of it without thinking, and now, in the dark, she thought about it and then told herself she was being ungenerous. He was simply making conversation. He was simply trying to understand the rhythms of a shared space. She texted Brianna, Day 1. Weird, but fine. He made pasta. Brianna replied with a single raised eyebrow emoji. Kayla laughed and put her phone down and went to sleep. Monday passed without incident. Kayla had a commercial shoot in the morning for a regional outdoor retailer, a catalog job unremarkable but well-paying, and was back at the apartment by 3 in the afternoon. Dale worked remotely, and she could hear the low, steady sound of his keyboard through his closed bedroom door. He knocked on her door at 6:30 to ask if she wanted dinner again. She said yes, because it seemed ungrateful to refuse twice in a row, and they ate leftover pasta and talked about nothing in particular, and afterward she retreated to her room and called her mother and told her everything was fine. But on Tuesday, something shifted, and Kayla felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, not with your eyes, but somewhere behind them. She had come out of her room in the early afternoon to make coffee and found Dale standing in the kitchen doorway, which would have been entirely unremarkable, except that he was simply standing there, not moving, not reaching for anything, not visibly engaged in any task. He was facing her door. When she appeared, he adjusted immediately, opened the refrigerator, pulled out the orange juice, but the adjustment was a half-second too late, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it. She made her coffee and said something neutral about the weather, and took her mug back to her room and locked the door for the first time. She called Brianna that evening and used the word uncomfortable for the first time. Brianna asked if she wanted to talk about it, and Kayla said she wasn't sure there was anything to talk about, that it might be nothing, that she was possibly projecting. Brianna said, gently but clearly, that projection and instinct were not the same thing. Kayla said she would give it another few days. Brianna said, okay. That was the last real conversation they had. Wednesday brought a stillness to the apartment that Kayla found harder to explain than anything that had come before it. Dale had been quieter than usual. No keyboard sounds from his room, no offer of dinner, no movement through the hallway in the hours she was awake. At one point, mid-afternoon, she became suddenly and completely certain that he was standing just outside her door. She couldn't hear anything. There was no shadow beneath the frame that she could see. It was simply a certainty that arrived without evidence, the kind that the body sometimes generates before the mind catches up. She sat very still for nearly a minute, then heard his bedroom door open and close at the far end of the hallway, and exhaled. That night she sent 2 texts. The first was to Brianna at 9:47 p.m. I think I need to find somewhere else sooner than 3 months. I'll explain later. Brianna, who was in a work dinner, didn't see it until nearly midnight. The second text was to a fellow model named Jasmine Tate, sent at 10:12 p.m. Hey, is your spare room still available? Asking for real this time. Jasmine replied the following morning. Kayla never saw the message. Thursday was the 4th day. What is known from the evidence comes in fragments, the kind of partial picture that investigators spend months assembling and defense attorneys spend equal time contesting. What is not disputed is that Kayla had a studio call scheduled for 10 in the morning and never arrived. The photographer, Marcus Webb, texted her at 10:15 and called at 10:30. He was mildly annoyed, then concerned, then, by noon, after 4 unanswered calls, genuinely alarmed. He contacted her agency, who attempted to reach her through 2 additional numbers, including her mother's. Denise Mercer called Kayla's phone 11 times between 12:15 and 2 in the afternoon. Each call rang through to voicemail. The last message Denise left is difficult to describe without losing something essential in the description. It lasted 47 seconds. It began with her name, Kayla, honey, it's Mom, and ended without a proper goodbye, the way messages end when the person leaving them has become too frightened to find a closing word. Inside the apartment, Dale's car was in the building's parking structure. A neighbor on the 3rd floor would later tell investigators that she had heard what she initially believed was furniture being dragged across a floor sometime in the early morning hours of Thursday. She estimated between 2 and 4 a.m., though she acknowledged she had been half asleep and could not be precise. She had not thought enough of it to get up. She went back to sleep. She would carry that decision like a stone in her chest for a very long time. By 3 in the afternoon on Thursday, Kayla's agency had contacted Charlotte Mecklenburg Police to request a wellness check. 2 officers arrived at Dale's building at 3:47. They knocked. They announced themselves. No one answered. What they found when the building supervisor opened the door would mark the beginning of an investigation that consumed the city's attention for months, and would ultimately reveal, piece by terrible piece, just how long Dale Pruitt had been waiting for the moment that finally arrived on that quiet, ordinary Thursday morning. The first officer through the door was a 7-year veteran named Sergeant Patricia Odom, and she would later tell the lead detective that she knew within 10 seconds of crossing the threshold. Not from anything she could see immediately, the living room was undisturbed, the topographical map still hanging perfectly centered above the couch, the kitchen counters bare and clean. She knew from the smell and from the particular quality of silence that fills a space where something irreversible has occurred. It is a silence that experienced officers recognize the way musicians recognize a note played a half step off. Something in the air had changed and not changed back. They moved through the apartment in the systematic, unhurried way that training demands, even when instinct screams to rush. The hallway, the bathroom, the linen closet, checked and cleared. Dale's bedroom door was open. The room was empty. The bed made with a tightness that suggested it had not been slept in or had been made with deliberate, almost anxious care. His laptop was gone. The closet held clothes, but fewer than the hangers suggested should be there, as though a selection had been made quickly, without the luxury of consideration. Kayla's door was closed. Sergeant Odom knocked twice, announced herself, and received no answer. She turned the handle and pushed the door open and stopped. Behind her, her partner made a sound that was not a word. The medical examiner's report, filed 11 days later, would use the precise evacuated language that forensic documents require. Cause of death, manner of death, estimated time, the clinical taxonomy of injury. What the report could not convey, and what the photographs entered into evidence only partially captured, was the stillness of the room itself. Kayla was on the floor beside the bed, partially covered by the comforter that had been pulled down from the mattress. Her auburn hair was spread across the hardwood in a way that, in any other context, might have looked deliberately arranged. She was 23 years old, and she had been dead for somewhere between 10 and 14 hours by the time Sergeant Odom found her. She had been strangled. The investigation that followed moved on 2 parallel tracks simultaneously, as such investigations always do. One track focused on the victim, the other on the man who was no longer there to explain himself. The victim's track yielded a portrait of a young woman whose life was ordinary in the best sense of the word, full of small plans and genuine affections and the particular forward momentum of someone who believed with reasonable evidence that things were going to get better. Detectives recovered her phone from beneath the bed where it had apparently slid during a struggle. Her final texts were logged and time-stamped. The message to Brianna at 9:47 p.m. the night before. The message to Jasmine Tate at 10:12 p.m. and one final text sent at 11:58 p.m., 54 minutes before midnight on the last night of her life, addressed to a number saved in her contacts as Mom. Don't call after 9. I'm going to look at moving out this week. Don't worry, I'll explain everything soon. Love you. Denise Mercer would not read that message for 3 days. When she finally did, in a hospital waiting room where a grief counselor sat beside her, she read it 7 times before she was able to speak. The second track, Dale, produced a different kind of portrait, assembled from sources that investigators described privately as both disturbing and extensive. His laptop was never recovered, but his desktop computer, left behind in what appeared to be an oversight born of panic, was seized under warrant and examined by the department's digital forensics unit. What they found on it rewrote the timeline of the crime entirely. Dale Pruitt had not developed his fixation on Kayla after she moved in. He had been cultivating it for years. His search history, spanning back nearly 4 years, contained her name with a regularity that investigators described as compulsive. Her agency's website, visited dozens of times, cached versions of regional campaign pages she had appeared in. A private folder, encrypted but ultimately cracked, holding 214 photographs, none of them intimate, none of them illegally obtained, but all of them pulled from public sources and organized with a categorizing precision that the forensic examiner found more disturbing than any single image. They were sorted by year, by location, by hair length. There were subcategories. There were file names that used her full name in combination with words that the examiner documented in the report, but that her family has since requested not be reproduced publicly. Beyond the photographs, investigators found evidence that Dale had manufactured the circumstances of their cohabitation with deliberate patience. Phone records subpoenaed from his carrier showed that he had called his father, Raymond, 3 times in the 2 weeks before reaching out to Kayla, not to ask whether she needed a roommate, as he had claimed, but to confirm details about her situation that Raymond had mentioned only in passing. He had known about her housing difficulty for nearly 2 months before calling her. He had waited, investigators believed, for the moment when her vulnerability was at its highest and her options felt most limited. The lease for his Charlotte apartment had been signed 6 weeks after Kayla's agency publicly announced on its website that she had joined their Charlotte roster. He had moved to be near her. 2. What happened inside the apartment during those 4 days, the specific sequence of decisions, the precise moment when Dale Pruitt crossed from obsession into action, would become the central question of the prosecution's case. Forensic evidence placed the time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. on Thursday morning, consistent with the neighbor's account of sounds overhead. The bedroom door had no lock. There was evidence of a struggle, a bedside lamp overturned, fingernail marks on the doorframe at a height consistent with someone bracing against it, a partial shoe impression in the carpet near the window that matched a size 11 boot, Dale's size. Her phone, forensics confirmed, had been moved after death. Someone had picked it up, looked at the screen, and set it back down in a slightly different position than where the screen's pressure sensors indicated it had last been placed while in use. He had read her final messages. He had known she was planning to leave. Investigators would spend considerable time debating whether this knowledge had accelerated what he had already intended or whether it had been the direct trigger. The distinction mattered legally. It mattered less to the people who had loved Kayla Mercer, for whom the cause had long since collapsed into the simple, devastating fact of the consequence. Charlotte Mecklenburg police issued a warrant for Dale Pruitt's arrest at 7:14 p.m. on Thursday evening, less than 4 hours after Kayla's body was found. By then, he had been gone for at least 15 hours. His car remained in the parking structure. He had left on foot, or been picked up, or found some other means of disappearing into a city that, until very recently, he had been invisible in by choice. The hunt for him began that night. It would last 6 days. The news broke on Friday morning, and Charlotte responded the way cities respond to violence that arrives without warning inside the ordinary. With a collective flinch, a reaching for phones, a sudden awareness of proximity. The story moved fast through local news stations, and faster still through social media, where Kayla's agency had posted a brief, carefully worded statement expressing grief and requesting privacy for the family. Someone shared a photograph alongside it, a professional headshot from one of her campaigns. Kayla looking directly into the camera with that particular quality of presence that cameras either find or don't, and in her case had always found effortlessly. Within 6 hours, the post had been shared 40,000 times. Within 24, the number had quadrupled. Brianna Cole learned what had happened from a text sent by Jasmine Tate, who had seen the news and remembered Kayla's unanswered message from Wednesday night. Brianna was in a coffee shop in Austin when her phone buzzed with Jasmine's message, and the barista who brought her order to the table would later describe to a friend how the woman at the window seat had gone completely still, the way people go still when something inside them stops. Brianna was on the first available flight back to Charlotte by that afternoon. She would spend the next 72 hours at Denise Mercer's side, holding a grief too large for either of them to carry alone. Denise had driven to Charlotte the moment police called her Thursday evening, before the news cycle had assembled itself around her daughter's name, before strangers with no connection to Kayla began posting condolences in comment sections. She had identified her daughter's body in the way that parents are asked to do such things, with a formality so clinical it feels like a cruelty, compounded upon a cruelty. She had not cried in the identification room. She had cried in the parking lot afterward, alone, sitting in her car with both hands pressed flat against the steering wheel. And the sound she made was one that the victim advocate assigned to her case would remember for years. Meanwhile, the search for Dale Pruitt had settled into the grim, methodical rhythm that fugitive investigations assume when the first hours of urgency give way to the reality of sustained pursuit. His car remained in the parking structure, which told investigators he had planned his exit. A man who panics doesn't leave his car behind deliberately, he simply runs. Leaving it suggested he had thought, at least partially, about what he was doing. Bus terminal surveillance footage was pulled and reviewed. Ride-share records were subpoenaed, his bank accounts were flagged for monitoring. And on Friday afternoon, a single transaction appeared, $240 withdrawn from an ATM on Independence Boulevard, 7 miles from the apartment. The timestamp read 1:17 a.m. Thursday, which placed the withdrawal roughly an hour after investigators believed Kayla had died. He had taken the money, and then, as far as the financial record was concerned, ceased to exist. Detective Raymond Carver, who had drawn the case on Thursday night and would carry it through to its conclusion, later said in a press interview that the ATM withdrawal told him 2 things simultaneously. First, that Dale had been calm enough in the aftermath to think about practical needs. Second, that he had not thought far enough ahead to understand that cash has a ceiling. $240 in a city where a motel room costs $80 a night bought him 3 days at most. After that, he would need to surface somewhere. The tip came on the 5th day, a Wednesday, from a motel clerk in Concord, a small city 20 miles northeast of Charlotte, who had been watching the news coverage and recognized the name on the register. Dale had checked in under his own name, which investigators found difficult to explain, and ultimately attributed to a cognitive narrowing that extreme stress sometimes produces in people who are not, by nature, practiced criminals. He had paid in cash. He had asked for a ground-floor room. He had not left the room, as far as the clerk could determine, in at least 2 days. When the clerk knocked to offer fresh towels on Tuesday afternoon, he had called out from behind the closed door that he didn't need anything, and she had noted that his voice sounded wrong in a way she couldn't specify, but didn't forget. A tactical unit surrounded the motel at 6:15 on Wednesday morning. The arrest was made without resistance. Dale Pruitt opened the door in response to the officer's commands and stepped out into the pale early light with the flat, evacuated expression of a man who had spent 5 days dismantling whatever internal architecture had once held him upright. He was wearing the same clothes he had left the apartment in. He had not shaved. The room behind him contained an empty bottle of bourbon, a duffel bag with 3 changes of clothing, and, on the nightstand beside the bed, a single photograph. A printed copy, slightly creased, of a professional image from one of Kayla's campaigns. He had carried it with him when he ran. He had kept it on the nightstand while he hid. Investigators did not release that detail to the press immediately. When it eventually emerged during pre-trial proceedings, Brianna read about it and called Denise, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Dale was transported to the Mecklenburg County Detention Center, processed and charged with first-degree murder. At his initial appearance before a magistrate that same afternoon, he stood with a stillness that the courtroom sketch artist later described as unsettling. Not the stillness of composure, but the stillness of a person who has stopped performing the social signals that make others feel at ease and no longer seems to notice the absence. He entered no plea. His court-appointed attorney requested a continuance, which was granted. Outside the courthouse, a small gathering had assembled despite the early hour, people who had followed the story across the week, some who had known Kayla in passing, some who simply felt the particular gravity that certain losses generate in a city. They were quiet. There were flowers. Someone had printed a photograph and placed it against the base of a concrete pillar, and the image was the same headshot the agency had used in their statement. Kayla, looking directly into the camera, present and unreachable in equal measure. Denise was not there. She was back in Harlan County by then, in the house where Kayla had grown up, sorting through the specific devastation of a parent who must decide which objects to keep and which to release, which rooms to enter, and which to leave closed for now. On the kitchen table, still in its envelope, was the last birthday card Kayla had sent her, 2 weeks before the move to Charlotte, before the decision that no one could have known would be the last significant decision of her life. Denise would later say in testimony that silenced the courtroom that she had not opened the card yet, that she was keeping it. That as long as it remained sealed, there was a version of the world in which Kayla had just written something ordinary inside, something warm and slightly funny the way she always was, and sealed it and licked the stamp and driven it to the post office without knowing it would be the last one. The preliminary hearing was held 6 weeks after Dale's arrest, and it was during those 6 weeks that the investigation expanded in a direction that even Detective Carver had not initially anticipated. The warrant for Dale's digital records had been broad by design, and what the forensic team continued to uncover in the weeks following his arrest transformed the case from a homicide investigation into something more unsettling. A documented study of a fixation that had been growing quietly and without interruption for nearly half of Kayla's adult life. The desktop computer yielded more as analysts dug deeper. Beyond the organized photograph folders, beyond the search history, investigators found a series of documents stored in a partition of the hard drive that Dale had attempted to encrypt using a commercial software tool. The encryption was competent but not sophisticated enough to withstand the department's forensic toolkit, and what emerged from behind it was a collection of text files, untitled, undated, written in the first person, that the prosecuting attorney would later describe in court as the most methodically disturbing material she had encountered in 14 years of criminal prosecution. The documents were not a journal in any conventional sense. They contained no reflections on his day, no emotional processing, no narrative arc. They were instead a record of logistics, addresses where Kayla had worked, cross-referenced with dates and times, notes on the schedules of her agency, compiled from public information and inference, observations about her habits, the coffee shop she frequented in Noda, the gym she used twice a week, the route she typically walked from the parking garage to the studio on Brevard Street. None of these observations required illegal access. All of them required sustained, invisible presence. He had been watching her, at varying distances and intervals, for at least 3 years before she moved into his apartment. The document that the prosecution ultimately chose not to read aloud in its entirety, citing the emotional welfare of Kayla's family, who were present in the courtroom, contained what appeared to be a detailed account of the evening Dale had decided to engineer their cohabitation. Written in the flat practical register that characterized all his files, it described his reasoning with a clarity that investigators found more disturbing than rage would have been. Rage, at least, is a temperature. What Dale had written read like a project plan. He had identified her housing situation as an opportunity. He had calculated the timing. He had rehearsed the phone call to his father twice, according to his own account, to ensure that the questions he needed answered would seem casual. He had written in a single sentence that the lead detective read and reread a dozen times in the weeks before trial. She won't leave if she feels she has nowhere better to go. It was the sentence of a man who had spent years thinking about how to make himself necessary to a person who did not know she was being studied. What the documents could not answer, and what the prosecution's case had to construct through physical and circumstantial evidence, was the precise sequence of events on the final night. The forensic reconstruction suggested that Dale had entered Kayla's room in the early hours of Thursday morning, after she had sent her final messages and before she had fallen fully asleep. The doorframe evidence indicated she had attempted to hold the door closed from the inside, which meant she had heard him in the hallway, which meant she had known in those last moments what was coming. The medical examiner testified that death had not been immediate, that Kayla had struggled. The defense attorney objected to portions of this testimony on the grounds that they were prejudicial, and the judge overruled each objection in turn, and in the gallery, Denise Mercer held Brianna's hand and did not look away from the witness stand. Dale sat through the proceedings with the same evacuated stillness that had characterized every public appearance since his arrest. He did not look at the evidence photographs when they were displayed. He did not look at the witness stand during Denise's testimony. He looked most often at a fixed point somewhere above the heads of the people in the gallery, as though the room he was physically present in and the room he was actually inhabiting were two different places. His defense centered on a diminished capacity argument that Dale suffered from a delusional disorder that had distorted his perception of reality and of his relationship with Kayla. A forensic psychiatrist testified for the defense that Dale had demonstrated symptoms consistent with erotomania, a condition in which a person develops the fixed, false belief that another individual, typically of higher social status, is in love with them. The psychiatrist was careful, precise, and persuasive in the technical sense. The prosecuting attorney spent 40 minutes on cross-examination, methodically dismantling the argument not by disputing the diagnosis, but by demonstrating that the documents recovered from Dale's computer showed unambiguous awareness at every stage that Kayla did not reciprocate his feelings, that she had, in fact, been planning to leave. A man in the grip of a delusion that the object of his obsession loves him does not write in his own files that she won't leave if she feels she has nowhere better to go. That was not delusion, that was strategy. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. When the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, Dale finally moved his gaze from its fixed point above the gallery and looked, for the first time during the entire proceeding, directly at Denise Mercer. No one who was present that day could say with certainty what his expression contained in that moment. The sketch artist, who had been watching his face for days, said later that it looked almost like recognition, as though he were seeing, for the first and final time, the full weight of what he had destroyed. Then the foreperson spoke, and the courtroom held its breath. The verdict was guilty, first-degree murder, premeditated, with a special finding of stalking as an aggravating circumstance. The jury had not needed 9 hours because the evidence was unclear. They had needed 9 hours because some decisions, even when the facts are unambiguous, demand that the people making them sit with the full weight of what they are about to do to another human life. That, at least, is what the foreperson said afterward to a reporter in the courthouse parking lot, quietly and without drama, before walking to her car and driving home to her family. In the gallery, the reaction was not the eruption that courtroom scenes and films have conditioned people to expect. There was no collective gasp, no sudden weeping, no outburst from the defense table. What happened instead was quieter and in many ways more devastating. A slow, collective exhale, as though the room had been holding its breath for months and had only now been granted permission to release it. Brianna pressed both hands over her mouth. The victim advocate, who had been assigned to Denise from the beginning, reached over and covered Denise's hand with her own. Denise sat perfectly still for a long moment, and then she closed her eyes, and whatever passed through her in those seconds remained entirely her own. Dale was remanded without bail pending sentencing. As the bailiff moved toward him, he stood without being asked, straightened his jacket with the same deliberate precision that had characterized every small movement throughout the trial, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. He did not look at Denise. He did not look at the jury. He looked forward, at a point beyond the door, and then he was gone. And the room that had contained his presence for weeks felt immediately and entirely different without him in it. The sentencing hearing took place 5 weeks later. Under North Carolina law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the death penalty having been taken off the table early in the proceedings following a series of legal arguments that the prosecution had ultimately chosen not to contest. The judge, a 22-year veteran of the criminal bench named Honorable Sandra Marsh, sentenced Dale Pruitt to life without parole to be served at a facility designated by the Department of Adult Correction. She then did something that judges are not required to do, and that this particular judge had done only twice before in her career. She departed from the formal language of the sentencing to address the victim's family directly. She said that the court had reviewed every piece of evidence in the case, and that what it revealed was not a crime of passion, not an act committed in a moment of lost control, but a sustained and calculated campaign against a young woman whose only error had been extending ordinary human trust to someone who had decided years before she ever walked through his door that she belonged to him. She said that the law had a word for what Dale Pruitt had done: murder, but that the word, precise as it was, did not fully encompass the years of invisible harm that had preceded it, the slow theft of safety that Kayla had never known was happening. She said that the sentence she was imposing was the maximum available to her, and that she imposed it without reservation. Dale said nothing during the hearing. He had waived his right to speak at sentencing. His attorney read a brief prepared statement expressing remorse on his behalf. No one in the gallery appeared moved by it. Denise Mercer spoke. She had written her statement by hand on lined notebook paper in the kitchen of the Harlan County house where Kayla had grown up. She had written it over the course of 11 evenings, crossing out and rewriting, trying to find language adequate to a loss that language was not built to carry, What she ultimately read aloud lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She spoke about Kayla's laugh, the specific, unguarded quality of it, the way it arrived before she could decide whether something was funny, the way it filled rooms. She spoke about the morning Kayla had called her from Nashville after her first real agency contract, her voice shaking with an excitement she was trying to contain and failing beautifully. She spoke about the birthday card on the kitchen table, still sealed, and she said to the courtroom and to the man seated at the defense table that she had finally opened it the week before sentencing. That inside it, Kayla had written exactly what Denise had known she would write. Something warm, something slightly funny, something that ended with, "I love you, Mom, more than you know." She said she was going to read those words every day for the rest of her life. And she said, her voice steady in a way that seemed to cost her everything, that no sentence imposed in any courtroom would return what had been taken, but that she was grateful in the cold and specific way that justice permits gratitude, that Dale Pruitt would spend the remainder of his life in a room he could not leave, the way her daughter had spent her final moments in a room she could not leave either. The courtroom was absolutely silent when she finished. In the months that followed, Brianna established a small fund in Kayla's name through her agency, designed to support young models from rural backgrounds who needed financial assistance during career transitions, the precise vulnerability that had placed Kayla in Dale's apartment. In its first year, the fund received donations from 41 states. Several came from people who had never met Kayla and knew her only from a single headshot shared millions of times across a week in April. A young woman with auburn hair looking directly into the camera, present and luminous, with no knowledge of what was waiting 4 days ahead. Detective Carver closed his case file on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 7 months after Sergeant Odom had pushed open the door at the end of the hallway. He sat for a while before putting the file away. He had worked homicides for 11 years and understood, in the practical and unsentimental way that the work eventually teaches, that closure is a word civilians use and investigators quietly set aside. Cases close, people don't. He put the file away. He went home to his family. He did not sleep well for a long time. Outside the Mecklenburg County Detention Center, in the particular silence of a Wednesday evening in late autumn, a city continued its ordinary business. The traffic and the commerce and the 10,000 small negotiations of people moving through their lives, mostly safe, mostly unaware of how thin the membrane is between the world as it appears and the world as it sometimes turns out to be. Kayla Mercer had been 23 years old. She had been planning to leave,